This story is based on real events. Over 50,000 German POWs were held in Texas camps during WWII. Many formed genuine friendships with Americans, and these experiences influenced post-war German attitudes toward democracy and helped establish strong U.S.-German relations. The specific characters and some dialogue are fictionalized, but the overall treatment, experiences, and transformation described are historically accurate. When the trains rolled into the scorching Texas plains in the summer of 1943, over 50,000 German prisoners of war had no idea what awaited them. They had been told stories about Americans, brutal, savage, vengeful. After all, they were the enemy. The Nazi propaganda machine had painted a clear picture. Capture by Americans meant torture, starvation, perhaps death. Lieutenant Hans Weber pressed his face against the small window of the prison train car as it slowed near the town of Hearne, Texas. Through the dust and heat waves, he could see them, dozens of local Texans standing along the tracks. Women, children, elderly men. They weren't holding weapons or shouting. They were simply watching. Some were even waving. Hans turned to his fellow prisoners, confusion written across his face. "What are they doing?" He whispered in German to Corporal Friedrich Becker beside him. "I don't know," Friedrich replied, his voice uncertain. "This doesn't match what we were told." As the train doors opened and the prisoners filed out into the blinding Texas sun, armed American soldiers stood ready. But what happened next would begin a transformation that none of these German soldiers could have predicted. The camp commander, a stocky Texas colonel named James Harrison, stepped forward. Instead of hatred in his eyes, there was something else entirely, stern professionalism mixed with an unexpected hint of humanity. "Gentlemen," he said through a translator, "you are now prisoners of war of the United States Army. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will be given shelter, food, medical care, and work. If you cooperate, you will find your time here tolerable. If you cause trouble, there will be consequences. But make no mistake, you are human beings, and you will be treated as such." Hans exchanged glances with Friedrich. Treated as human beings. Was this some kind of trick? Over the next few weeks, as more trains arrived at camps scattered across Texas, from Hearne to Huntsville, from mineral wells to Mexia, over 50,000 German POWs would discover something that shook their entire understanding of the world. Something that Nazi propaganda had never prepared them for. They were about to witness the real America. And it would change many of them forever. The first shock came at dinner on the first day. The German prisoners had been marched into the mess hall, a large wooden structure with long tables and benches. They had expected thin soup, maybe stale bread, the kind of rations that barely kept you alive. That's what happened in German POW camps, after all. Why would the Americans be any different? When the kitchen staff began serving, Hans Weber couldn't believe his eyes. On his metal tray appeared roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, fresh bread with butter, and for dessert, apple pie. He stared at the food, then at the American soldier serving him. "Is this for us?" he asked in broken English. The soldier, a young man from Dallas named Bobby Jenkins, looked confused by the question. "Yeah, buddy. It's chow time. Eat up." Hans sat down slowly, still suspicious. Around him, other German prisoners were equally stunned. Some refused to eat at first, convinced the food must be poisoned. Others devoured it quickly, as if it might disappear. Friedrich sat across from Hans, tears streaming down his face as he ate. "Hans," he whispered, "I haven't eaten like this in 2 years. Not since before I was deployed." That night in the barracks, the Germans talked in hushed voices. "Why are they feeding us so well?" one asked. "It must be part of a plan," another suggested. "They're fattening us up for something." But as days turned into weeks, the meals continued. Breakfast brought eggs, bacon, toast, and coffee. Lunch was substantial sandwiches with fruit. Dinner varied but was always generous. The prisoners began to gain weight, their hollow cheeks filling out, their strength returning. One evening, Hans approached Bobby Jenkins, the soldier who often served in the mess hall. "Why?" Hans asked simply. Why you feed us so good? Bobby thought for a moment, then shrugged. Because that's what decent folks do. You're prisoners, not animals. Plus, he added with a grin, my mama raised me right. She'd whip me if she heard I was starving anybody, even Germans. This simple answer confused Hans more than any complex explanation could have. Where was the hatred? Where was the revenge? These Americans were supposed to be the enemy, yet they were treating German soldiers better than the German army had treated its own men in the field. It was the first crack in the wall of everything Hans had been taught to believe. By the fall of 1943, something extraordinary was happening across Texas POW camps. Despite language barriers, despite being enemies at war, despite years of propaganda on both sides, friendships were forming. At Camp Herne, a young German prisoner named Otto Schultz discovered he had a talent that transcended war. He could fix anything mechanical. When the camp's water pump broke down, threatening the entire facility's water supply, Otto volunteered to look at it. Within 2 hours, he had it running perfectly. The camp's maintenance supervisor, a grizzled Texan named Earl Thompson, who'd been too old for military service, was impressed. Son, where'd you learn to do that? Earl asked through a translator. Otto explained that before the war, he'd been an apprentice mechanic in Munich. He'd been drafted at 19, trained as a soldier, and sent to North Africa, where he was eventually captured. I never wanted to fight, Otto admitted quietly. I wanted to fix cars. Earl looked at the young German for a long moment. Then he did something that would have been unthinkable in a German POW camp. He offered Otto a job. How'd you like to work with me in the maintenance shop? I could use the help, and you seem to know what you're doing. Over the next months, Otto and Earl worked side by side. Earl taught Otto American slang and about Texas culture. Otto taught Earl German songs and shared stories of his home in Bavaria. They discovered they both loved fishing, both had younger sisters they worried about, and both hated Brussels sprouts. One day, Earl brought Otto a photograph. It showed his son, Michael, in an American Army uniform. That's my boy, Earl said, his voice thick. He's somewhere in Europe right now, fighting your people. Otto looked at the photo, then at Earl, understanding the weight of what Earl was sharing. I hope he comes home safe, Otto said sincerely. I hope all of them do. On both sides, Earl nodded slowly. Yes, son. Me too. Similar stories played out across Texas. At Camp Huntsville, a German prisoner who'd been a teacher before the war started giving English lessons to other prisoners and German lessons to interested American guards. At Camp Mexia, German prisoners and local farmers worked together in the cotton fields, developing mutual respect for each other's work ethic. The most surprising friendships formed between German officers and Texas ranchers. Many of the German officers were educated, cultured men from good families, not the monsters Allied propaganda had portrayed. When local ranchers needed help during labor shortages, some POWs were allowed to work on ranches under supervision. These ranchers discovered that many German prisoners were professional, hardworking and grateful for the opportunity to work outdoors rather than sit idle in camp. In return, the Germans discovered that Texas ranchers, while tough and direct, were also fair, generous, and treated them with respect. It was becoming harder and harder to hate people once you knew their names, their stories, their humanity. Perhaps nothing shocked the German prisoners more than what happened on Sundays. At Camp Herne, the camp administration had built a small chapel. But unlike the rigid, militaristic approach they'd expected, the Americans did something remarkable. They allowed the German prisoners to hold their own church services, in German, led by German POWs who'd been priests or pastors before the war. Father Klaus Becker, a Catholic priest who'd been serving as a medic when captured, couldn't believe it when the camp commander asked if he'd be willing to lead services. You want me to minister to the men? Klaus asked, stunned. Well, yeah, Colonel Harrison replied. You're a priest, aren't you? These men need spiritual care. That's your job. The first Sunday service drew nearly 200 German prisoners. They sang hymns in German, prayed in their mother tongue, and for the first time since capture felt a connection to home. Many wept openly, But the truly shocking part came when American soldiers began attending too, not to spy or intimidate, but to worship. Some were German Americans who knew the language and hymns. Others simply wanted to pray, finding something authentic in the Germans' raw faith. Private Tommy Schultz, whose grandparents had emigrated from Germany to Texas in 1890, attended regularly. One Sunday after services, he approached Father Klaus. "Father, can I ask you something?" "Of course, my son," Klaus replied in English. "How can you still have faith?" "After everything you've seen, everything that's happened." Klaus looked at the young American soldier thoughtfully. "Because faith is not about deserving peace. It's about finding peace even when you don't deserve it. We are all sinners, my son. German, American, it doesn't matter. But God's love doesn't see uniforms. Word of the services spread. Local Texan families began donating hymnals, Bibles, and even musical instruments. A rancher's wife named Martha Wilson, whose own son was fighting in France, brought her old piano to the camp. "Music brings people together," she said simply. "Maybe if we sing the same hymns, we'll remember we're all God's children." One particularly moving Sunday, Father Klaus preached about loving your enemy, citing Jesus' words from the Sermon on the Mount. "We are commanded to love," he said in German, with Tommy translating for the Americans present. "Not because our enemies deserve it, but because love is the only force powerful enough to end hatred." After the service, Colonel Harrison approached Klaus. "Father, that was a fine sermon. Made me think about my own heart, about the anger I've been carrying." Klaus smiled. "Colonel, that is all any of us can do. Examine our own hearts and ask God to make them more like His." In that moment, in a prisoner of war camp in the heart of Texas, the lines between captor and captive blurred. They were simply men seeking grace, seeking peace, seeking to remember their humanity in the midst of humanity's darkest hour. As 1944 progressed, something unprecedented began happening in the Texas POW camps. They were becoming centers of education and culture. The German prisoners, many of whom were well educated before the war, were not content to simply sit and wait for the war to end. With the administration's approval, they began organizing classes, lectures, and cultural programs. At Camp Huntsville, Professor Ernst Lehmann, who taught history at Heidelberg University before being drafted, started an informal university. He taught courses on literature, philosophy, mathematics, and languages. American guards were allowed and even encouraged to attend. Sergeant Bill Crawford, a Texas farm boy who'd never graduated high school, found himself sitting in on Professor Lehmann's philosophy lectures. "I never thought I'd be learning about Socrates from a German prisoner," Bill admitted to his wife in a letter home. "But Professor Lehmann makes it all make sense. He's the smartest man I've ever met, and it's hard to remember we're supposed to be enemies." The education wasn't one-directional. American soldiers taught the Germans about American history, democracy, and the ideals the United States was founded upon. For many German prisoners who'd been raised under Nazi ideology, this was revolutionary information. Hans Weber, the lieutenant who'd arrived on that first train, found himself increasingly troubled by what he was learning. He attended a lecture given by an American captain about the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Concepts of individual liberty, freedom of speech, separation of powers. "Wait," Hans interrupted, struggling with the English. "You can criticize your own government? You don't go to prison?" The captain smiled. "Not only can we, but we should. That's what freedom means. The right to disagree, to speak up, to demand better from our leaders." Hans sat back, his mind reeling. In Germany, such talk would have gotten you arrested by the Gestapo. How had he never questioned this before? The cultural exchange extended beyond academics. German prisoners organized concerts, performing classical music on donated instruments. They staged plays, both German and American. Some camps even formed sports leagues, with German and American teams competing in soccer, volleyball, and baseball. At Camp Mexia, a German prisoner named Ludwig, who'd been an art teacher, organized an art class. He taught perspective, shading, and composition to both German prisoners and American guards. Soon, the camp was filled with artwork, landscapes of Texas, portraits of fellow prisoners and guards, and scenes from memory of homes far away. One of Ludwig's students was Guard Corporal James Martinez, whose family had ranched in Texas for generations. James created a painting of his family's ranch at sunset. Ludwig helped him perfect the play of light on the hills. When it was finished, Ludwig said, "James, you should be proud. This is beautiful work." James looked at his teacher, this German enemy who'd shown him such kindness and patience. "Professor Ludwig, when this war is over, I want you to know something. You changed my life. You showed me I could create something beautiful, not just destroy." Ludwig's eyes filled with tears. "My friend, that is the highest compliment a teacher can receive. These moments of human connection, of learning and growth, were transforming both Germans and Americans. The prisoners were discovering that Americans valued education, culture, and individual growth. The Americans were discovering that Germans weren't the monsters propaganda had portrayed. They were teachers, artists, thinkers, and dreamers who'd been caught up in a terrible war. The winter of 1944 brought an incident that would become legendary in the history of Texas POW camps. A German prisoner at Camp Herne named Werner Schmidt became seriously ill with pneumonia. The camp doctor did everything he could, but Werner's condition deteriorated rapidly. It became clear he was dying. Werner had one desperate wish, to see his younger brother Karl, who was imprisoned at a different camp 200 miles away. According to military protocol, such a request should have been denied. Moving prisoners between camps was complicated, risky, and against standard procedure, but Colonel Harrison made a decision that could have ended his career. He authorized Karl's transfer to Camp Herne so the brothers could see each other one last time. When Karl arrived and was brought to the camp infirmary, the scene moved even the hardest soldiers to tears. The brothers, who hadn't seen each other since before their separate captures, embraced. Werner, barely conscious, smiled for the first time in days. "Bruder," Werner whispered. "You're here." "I'm here," Karl replied, holding his brother's hand. "I'm here." Werner died 3 days later with Karl by his side. But those 3 days, that act of compassion from an American colonel who chose humanity over regulation, echoed through every POW camp in Texas. German prisoners who'd heard the story looked at their captors with new eyes. This is what the enemy does? This is American cruelty. Acts of kindness, large and small, became commonplace. When a prisoner received news that his family in Germany had been killed in Allied bombing, guards sat with him in his grief, offering what comfort they could despite the language barrier. When American soldier David Wilson's father died back in Texas, German prisoner Otto, who'd become his friend through their work in the maintenance shop, carved a beautiful wooden cross as a memorial gift. David kept that cross for the rest of his life. At Camp Huntsville, a group of German prisoners learned that their guard, Corporal Sam Peters, and his wife had just had their first baby. The prisoners pooled their meager resources and crafted a beautiful wooden cradle, intricately carved with scenes from German fairy tales. When they presented it to Sam, he broke down crying. "I don't understand," Sam said through tears. "We're at war. My brothers are over there fighting your people. Why would you do this for me?" Professor Lehman, who'd organized the gift, replied simply, "Because your child is innocent, Sam. All children are innocent. And because you have treated us like human beings, not animals. This is our way of saying thank you." Perhaps the most touching story came from Camp Mexia. A group of German prisoners, working on a local farm, noticed that the farmer's young daughter, 8-year-old Sarah, was confined to a wheelchair due to polio. Using scrap wood and materials, the prisoners spent weeks building her a beautiful playhouse, something her family could never have afforded. When they presented it to Sarah, her face lit up with joy. Her father, Henry Coleman, who'd been skeptical of having German POWs work his land, was moved beyond words. "You didn't have to do this," Henry said, his voice choking. One of the Germans, a father himself named Johann, knelt down to Sarah's level. "In Germany I have daughter, same age as you. I hope someone is being kind to her while I'm gone." "This is for her too." Henry Coleman shook Johann's hand, then pulled him into an embrace. Two men, one American, one German, united in their love for their children, in their shared humanity. These acts of compassion weren't sanctioned by any policy or regulation. They were simply human beings choosing kindness over hatred, choosing to see each other as people rather than enemies. And they were changing hearts on both sides of the wire fence. As 1945 began and the war entered its final phase, something crucial started happening in the Texas camps. German prisoners began learning the truth about what their country had been doing. American authorities, adhering to the Geneva Convention, had been careful not to propagandize the prisoners. But now, as Allied forces liberated concentration camps, the evidence of Nazi atrocities was undeniable. Films, photographs, and testimony from liberated camps were shown to the German prisoners. The reaction was complex and painful to watch. Some refused to believe it. Surely this was Allied propaganda. Others were shocked into silence, forced to confront the reality of what had been done in their name. Still, others had suspected but hadn't wanted to know. Hans Weber sat in the camp theater as footage from Dachau played on the screen. The emaciated bodies, the mass graves, the survivors who looked like walking skeletons. His hands shook. He felt physically ill. After the screening, Hans sought out Father Klaus. "I served my country," Hans said, his voice breaking. "I thought I was defending Germany. But this, what was I defending? What have we done?" Father Klaus had no easy answers. He'd been struggling with the same questions. "Hans, most of us didn't know. We were soldiers, doing what we thought was our duty. But now we know, and we must live with that knowledge. We must decide who we will be going forward." The revelations split the camp. A hardcore group of Nazi loyalists insisted the evidence was fabricated. They remained defiant, hateful, refusing to acknowledge what their nation had done. These men made life difficult for everyone, enforcing a kind of Nazi discipline within the camp, threatening prisoners who became too friendly with Americans. But many others, perhaps the majority, were devastated by the truth. They believed they were fighting for their homeland, for their families. Now they had to reconcile the Germany they loved with the Germany that had committed unthinkable evil. Otto, Hans's friend who worked in maintenance, expressed what many felt. "Earl," he said to his American supervisor one day, "I am ashamed. I'm German, and I am ashamed." Earl put a hand on Otto's shoulder. "Son, you're not responsible for what others did. You're only responsible for who you choose to be now. And from what I've seen, you're choosing to be a good man." The American approach to this difficult period was notable. Rather than gloat or seek revenge, many guards and officers showed compassion for the prisoners' distress. They understood that having your entire worldview shattered was traumatic. They'd seen the same struggle in German-American communities throughout the war, people torn between their heritage and their horror at what Germany had become. Colonel Harrison organized discussion groups where prisoners could process what they'd learned, ask questions, and begin to understand how Nazi ideology had led to such evil. Professor Lehmann, who'd lost his own Jewish colleagues to the camps, led many of these sessions. "Gentlemen," Lehmann said in one particularly emotional session, "we were told the Jews were our enemy. We were told they were subhuman. We were told many lies. But lies only work when we stop thinking for ourselves, when we surrender our individual moral responsibility to a leader or a party. The question we must each answer is, will we ever make that mistake again?" This period of reckoning was painful but necessary. For many German prisoners, their time in Texas became about more than just waiting out the war. It became about rebuilding their understanding of the world, about learning what freedom and democracy really meant, about recognizing the humanity in everyone, including those they'd been taught to hate. And for the Americans, it was a reminder that defeating an enemy on the battlefield wasn't enough. They needed to win hearts and minds, to show that democracy and human dignity weren't just propaganda slogans. They were principles worth living by. May 8th, 1945. VE Day. The war in Europe was over. In the Texas POW camps, the news brought complex emotions. German prisoners gathered around radios, hearing that their nation had surrendered unconditionally. Some wept in relief that the killing had stopped. Others wept in despair, mourning their defeated homeland. Many felt both. Hans Weber stood outside the barracks at Camp Herne, staring at the Texas sky. It was over. Years of fighting, suffering, death, over. But what did that mean for him? Germany was defeated, occupied, divided. His hometown in the American zone or the Soviet zone? Were his parents still alive? His sister? What world was he returning to? Friedrich found him there. They say we might not go home for months, maybe even a year or more, Friedrich said quietly. They need to organize repatriation, rebuild Germany enough to receive us. I'm not sure what home means anymore, Hans admitted. The Germany I left doesn't exist. The Germany I thought I was fighting for never existed. In the days following VE Day, the relationship between prisoners and guards evolved yet again. They were no longer soldiers on opposite sides of an active war. They were simply men waiting for the next chapter of their lives to begin. Work details continued. Education classes continued. But there was a new quality to the interactions, a kind of bittersweet awareness that this unusual community would soon end. Friendships that had formed across enemy lines would be tested by separation and distance. Otto and Earl spent long hours together in the maintenance shop, working on projects but mostly just talking. "Earl," Otto said one day, "when I go back to Germany, I will open a shop. Fix cars, tractors, machines, and I will tell everyone about the Texan who treated me like a human being, who taught me that enemies can become friends." Earl pulled out a piece of paper. "I wrote down my address. When you get that shop opened, you write to me. Let me know you're okay. And Otto, you'll always have a friend in Texas." Similar conversations played out across the camps. Guards and prisoners exchanged addresses, made promises to write, shared final stories and memories. There was grief in these goodbyes, a recognition that something precious and unusual had been created in these camps. A bridge between two nations, two peoples who'd been told to hate each other but had chosen connection instead. The hardcore Nazi prisoners remained bitter and defiant. But they were now a minority. Most German prisoners were leaving Texas with a fundamentally different understanding of America and Americans than they'd arrived with. One evening, Colonel Harrison gathered the prisoners at Camp Herne for a final address. "Gentlemen," he said through a translator, "soon you will be going home. You will be returning to a Germany that has been defeated, occupied, and must be rebuilt. That will be hard. Many of you will face hunger, hardship, and difficult questions from your countrymen about your time here. But I want you to remember something. What happened here in Texas wasn't about America being better than Germany. It was about human beings treating each other with dignity and respect. Take that home with you. Build a new Germany on those principles. And know that you will always have friends in Texas." Many prisoners wept as those words were translated. They'd come as enemies and were leaving as something else. Not quite friends, perhaps, but certainly not enemies anymore. They were men who'd been given a glimpse of a different way, a better way of relating to each other across national and ideological divides. The repatriation process was slow and complicated. It wasn't until late 1945 and into 1946 that most German prisoners began their journey home. The transatlantic voyage was somber, men returning to an uncertain future in a devastated homeland. When Hans Weber finally arrived in Germany in February 1946, he was shocked by what he saw. His hometown, once beautiful and intact, was largely rubble. The Americans had bombed it. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same Americans who'd treated him so well in Texas had destroyed his city. But something in Hans had changed. Where once he would have felt only hatred and desire for revenge, now he felt something more complex. He understood why the bombing had happened. He understood that his nation had started this war, had committed atrocities that demanded justice. The Americans who'd bombed his city and the Americans who'd treated him humanely in Texas weren't contradictions. They were both parts of a nation trying to defeat evil while maintaining their own humanity. Hans found his parents alive, living in the basement of their damaged home. His sister had survived, working now for the American occupation forces as a translator. The reunion was joyful, but tinged with sorrow for all that had been lost. "What was it like?" his father asked. "As a prisoner in America?" Hans thought about how to answer. How could he explain? "Father, they treated us better than our own army treated us. They fed us, educated us, respected us. I met Americans who showed me what freedom and democracy really mean." I know that sounds strange, but it's true. Over the coming months and years, Hans and thousands of other returned prisoners became part of Germany's rebuilding. Many brought with them the lessons they'd learned in American POW camps, about democracy, about human dignity, about the possibility of former enemies becoming friends. Otto opened his repair shop in Munich, just as he'd promised Earl. He wrote letters to his Texas friend regularly, sharing his struggles and successes in rebuilding Germany. Earl wrote back, sending care packages when he could, maintaining a friendship that transcended the war. Father Klaus returned to his parish to find much of his congregation scattered or dead, but he rebuilt, preaching messages of reconciliation and peace, of the importance of seeing humanity in everyone. His sermons often referenced his time in Texas, the Americans who'd allowed him to minister, the friendships that had formed across enemy lines. Professor Lehman returned to teaching, but with a new mission. He taught his students about the dangers of authoritarianism, about the importance of critical thinking and moral courage. He often spoke of his time teaching in a Texas POW camp, of Americans and Germans learning together despite the war. Not all stories had happy endings. Some prisoners returned to find their families dead, their homes destroyed, their futures bleak. Some struggled with guilt over what Germany had done. Some faced accusations from fellow Germans for being too friendly with the Americans, for accepting defeat too readily. But many former Texas POWs became leaders in the new Germany, politicians, teachers, business owners, clergy. They remembered what they'd seen, what they'd experienced, and they worked to build a Germany that reflected those better values. The friendships that had formed in Texas endured. Letters crossed the Atlantic. Some Americans visited Germany, some Germans eventually visited Texas. The bonds that had been created in those unusual years proved stronger than national borders or historical enmity. Today, most Americans don't know this story. The German POW camps in Texas aren't taught in history classes. The friendships between captors and captives have been forgotten by most. But for those who lived it, and for their descendants, the story remains powerful. In 1976, 30 years after the war ended, a reunion was held in Texas. Former German POWs returned to visit the camps where they'd been held. They met with the American soldiers and local Texans who'd interacted with them during the war. It was an emotional gathering, old men embracing, sharing memories, introducing their children and grandchildren to former enemies who'd become lifelong friends. Hans Weber, now a successful businessman in Germany and father of 3, stood with Bobby Jenkins, the soldier who'd served him that first shocking meal. "Bobby," Hans said, his English much improved over the decades, "that first day when you gave me real food and treated me like a human being, you changed my life. You showed me that propaganda was lies, that Americans weren't monsters. You helped me become a better man." Bobby, now retired and grandfather of 5, smiled. "Hans, we were just doing what was right, but I'm glad we did. Look at what came from it. Friendship, peace, a new Germany that's become one of our strongest allies. That's what happens when you choose to see the humanity in your enemy." The story of German POWs in Texas offers profound lessons for our time. It demonstrates that even in the midst of history's most destructive war, Human beings can choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over hatred, connection over division. It shows that treating enemies with dignity isn't weakness, it's strategic brilliance. Many of those German POWs became champions of democracy in post-war Germany, building bridges between former enemies that have lasted generations. It reveals that ordinary people, Texas farmers, guards, townspeople, can make extraordinary differences through small acts of kindness and by refusing to dehumanize those they're told to hate. The Texas POW camps represent a road not taken in human history, a glimpse of what's possible when we choose our better angels over our worst impulses. In a time when the world seems increasingly divided, when dehumanization of the other seems to be rising again, this story offers hope. It reminds us that behind every uniform, every nationality, every ideology are human beings with families, dreams, fears, and the capacity for change. It shows that walls and fences can't prevent human connection when people choose to see each other truly. The German soldiers who arrived in Texas in 1943 expected cruelty and found compassion. They expected hatred and found friendship. They expected to be treated as monsters and instead were treated as men. And in that treatment, many of them were transformed. This is the secret behind WWII that shocked German POWs. America at its best isn't defined by its military might or economic power. It's defined by the simple human decency of ordinary people who choose to do the right thing, even when it's easier to do wrong, who choose to build bridges even with enemies, who understand that peace is built not just by defeating armies, but by winning hearts. The story of German POWs in Texas isn't just history, it's a blueprint for a better future. In a world that still struggles with hatred, division, and dehumanization, it stands as proof that another way is possible, that enemies can become friends, that compassion is strength, not weakness, that the human spirit, when given a chance, will always choose connection over isolation, understanding over hatred, hope over despair. The Texans, who shocked German POWs with their humanity, didn't know they were making history. They were simply living their values, treating others as they wished to be treated, refusing to let war strip away their decency. And in doing so, they changed the world, one meal, one conversation, one act of kindness at a time. That's the real secret. That's the lesson. That's the legacy worth remembering.